Hi guys, if you are listening to this story at night, when the light in the room has softened, when the outside world is slowly falling silent, then this is a very fitting moment, not to look for quick answers, but to ask a slow question. We are living in a particular age, an age that believes anything of value must last a long time. Buildings are designed to stand for centuries. Data is backed up, so it will never be lost. Memories are recorded, photographed, archived, as if disappearance itself were a failure. But if we turn and look back at the past, very far back, very deep, we encounter something that makes us pause. Not every ancient civilization built with the desire for permanence. Some of the greatest structures in human history were designed with one certainty from the very beginning: they would not last. Not because of a lack of technical skill, not because people did not know how to build durably, and certainly not by accident, but because that was precisely their purpose. In modern archaeology, we often evaluate a civilization based on what remains: walls still standing, stone columns not yet fallen, cities buried but still able to be excavated. But this way of seeing has a serious flaw. It assumes that what matters most is what lasts the longest. And while we have been busy searching for immortal structures, we have overlooked another current of thought, quieter yet no less widespread in the ancient world. A way of thinking that holds that. A structure is not an object. It is an action, a ritual, a temporary point of meeting between humans' nature and cosmic order. When the ritual ends, the structure should end as well. Try to imagine this. What if a structure were built to be used for only a single astronomical moment? What if it were erected solely to mark one encounter between the Earth and the sky? What if its purpose were to be buried, to be abandoned, or to be left for wind and rain to erase? Then the fact that it does not survive to the present is not a tragedy. It is a complete fulfillment. In this story, we will not be searching for lost civilizations. We will explore civilizations that consciously accepted dissolution. We will move through 7 ancient sites stretching from the Neolithic era to the complex empires of Southeast Asia. Each of them shares one thing in common: they were not born to stay. And it is precisely this fact that makes them some of the greatest questions in archaeology. There are places that were completed and then immediately buried. There are places built from materials certain to decay. There are systems so intricate that if the world fell even slightly out of rhythm, they collapsed entirely. And there are vast traces created not for humans to see, but for the sky to look down upon. This is not a story about collapse, nor is it a story about forgetting. It is a story about a different way of thinking about time. A world where permanence is not the goal, where disappearance does not mean failure, and where sometimes the most sacred things are precisely those that do not try to last forever. Let this story unfold slowly. There is no need to remember every detail. No need to remain fully awake. Just listen, because these civilizations did not build for us, but perhaps they still have something to say. At the southeastern edge of Anatolia, where the limestone plateau opens onto wide, empty horizons, there was once a hill that looked like countless other hills. No walls, no watchtowers, no sign of a city. For thousands of years, wind passed over it without obstruction. Rain fell and soaked into the ground as if this place had never carried any special meaning at all. And yet it was precisely this silence, a silence lasting nearly 12 millennia, that concealed something forcing human history to revise the way it understands itself. Beneath that seemingly unremarkable layer of soil lay Göbekli Tepe, one of the oldest structures ever built by human beings, and also one of the most enigmatic, not because it is too advanced, but because it appears to follow none of the familiar logic of long-term permanence. Göbekli Tepe does not sit in a fertile valley. It does not follow a great river. It is not protected by naturally defensible terrain. Judged by modern intuition, this is not a sensible place to build anything important. And yet, around 9600 BCE, long before stable agriculture, before permanent settlement, before the invention of the wheelwrighting or metal, someone decided to erect here massive T-shaped stone pillars, up to 5 meters tall and weighing tens of tons, intricately carved with animal figures: lions, snakes, wild boar, foxes, aurochs, birds of prey. These are not random decorative images, but repeated intentional symbols arranged within clearly ritualized circular stone enclosures. What is shocking is not only the age, although that number alone, when placed within the timeline of human history, is enough to unsettle long-held assumptions. What is more profoundly shocking is the human context behind the structure. According to all reliable archaeological evidence currently available, the people who built Göbekli Tepe were not settled farmers, not early urban dwellers, and certainly not a society with specialized labor classes. They were hunter-gatherer communities living by seasonal rhythms, moving with animal herds and plant cycles, carrying their world through memory ritual and relationships rather than fixed architecture. On this hilltop, there are no house foundations for sleeping overnight, no domestic hearths for everyday warmth, no food storage facilities for long-term planning, and no cemeteries marking permanent attachment to the land. Göbekli Tepe, in that sense, was not a place where people lived. It was a place people came to and then left. And it is precisely this deliberate separation that allows the site to speak of something very different about how ancient people understood their world, about how they distinguished living space from sacred space, the everyday from moments beyond the everyday. If one were to stand inside a stone circle at Göbekli Tepe in the early morning when thin mist still hovers over the plateau and the first slanting sunlight sharpens the edges of stone while leaving the rest in shadow, the initial sensation would not be one of overwhelming monumentality. It would be the feeling of the presence of an order that requires no explanation, no signage, yet can be sensed intuitively. The stone pillars do not stand randomly like rocks pushed together by wind and rain. They are arranged in circular or oval patterns with carefully considered spacing, as if each pillar knew its place within the whole. At the center stand two larger, taller, heavier pillars facing one another, forming an invisible axis, a focal point around which the entire space turns. They are not merely architectural elements. They resemble central figures in a wordless ritual representing something beyond the rest, beyond even the people who erected them. On the surfaces of these pillars, the relief carvings do not appear as illustrations of daily life. There are no hunting scenes told in sequence, no humans in action, no narrative in the conventional sense. Instead, animal figures appear in tense stillness, as if they are present rather than depicted. Lions, foxes, wild boar, snakes, aurochs, birds of prey, all appear not as sources of food, but as forces. They are not domesticated in imagery. They are not shown under human control. They confront the viewer with the gaze of an unconquered natural world of powers that humans must acknowledge, negotiate with, and respect. The way these carvings are arranged, repeated symmetrical, sometimes separated, sometimes combined, suggests they were not meant to tell a specific story, but to evoke a system of meaning. In this system, each animal is not merely an individual creature, but an expression of a quality, a role within a cosmic order, aggression, vigilance, renewal, movement between worlds. In a society without writing, these images may have functioned as a condensed language, a language not for conveying everyday information, but for sustaining and reactivating a shared spiritual world. When people entered the stone circles, they did not read the carvings as entertainment. They stepped into a symbolic structure already familiar through ritual oral tradition and collective memory. This reveals a clear distinction in the thinking of the communities that created Göbekli Tepe. Everyday life hunting gathering moving took place elsewhere. This site was not for the repetition of survival. It was for rare moments when humans needed to step outside habitual rhythms to confront larger questions, the relationship between humans and animals, between community and the invisible world, between social order and cosmic order. Göbekli Tepe, therefore, was not the center of material life, but a convergence point of meaning, a place that became alive only when people were present and was fully prepared to fall silent when they departed. In that early light among the still-standing pillars, one can sense that this order was never intended to be infinite. It was not designed to withstand every fluctuation of time. It was designed to be right for the moment, right for the ritual, right for the worldview of those who built it. And within this temporary rightness, Göbekli Tepe reveals a very different understanding of architecture and meaning, that some spaces are not created to endure, but to fulfill a spiritual role and then quietly yield to the flow of time. But perhaps the most important aspect of Göbekli Tepe lies not in how it was built, but in how it ended. Each stone enclosure, after a period of use, was deliberately filled in, not by natural disaster, not by gradual erosion. Archaeologists have found clear evidence that the people who used Göbekli Tepe intentionally brought soil rubble, animal bones, even fragments of tools to bury these structures. The infilling was careful, systematic, and repeated. When a ritual circle completed its role, it was not abandoned. It was closed. From a modern perspective, this act building and then intentionally burying seems almost unacceptable. We are raised within a very clear logic: effort must be preserved, value must remain visible, and the longer something lasts, the more important it must be. We build houses to last generations, monuments to commemorate, museums to store. When a structure collapses, we call it a loss. When a site is buried, we see a disaster requiring excavation. So when confronted with Göbekli Tepe, the reflexive question arises: why do this? Why mobilize labor, skill, and time resources extraordinarily precious to hunter-gatherer communities, only to cover everything with earth, as if erasing one's own traces? Yet this reflex exposes a deeply modern assumption. We rarely question that the value of a structure is inseparable from its long-term physical survival. We measure achievement by durability, lifespan, the ability to persist unchanged across centuries. Within this logic, deliberately burying a structure seems equivalent to denying its value. And Göbekli Tepe, through this intentional ending, challenges that assumption at its foundation, not through words, but through how it was treated. If we set aside modern standards and attempt to view Göbekli Tepe from within the worldview of its builders, the act of burial becomes less irrational. In many ancient systems of thought, value did not lie in how long an object endured, but in how fully it fulfilled its role. A ritual need not continue forever to be effective. A sacred song need not be sung endlessly to retain meaning. On the contrary, infinite repetition could dilute the sacred. When a ritual ends, the ritual space must also close, otherwise it becomes an empty shell existing without being activated by action and meaning. Seen this way, Göbekli Tepe may not have been understood as a monument to be admired, but as a process. It was built to host specific events, cyclical gatherings, rituals, binding the community moments when humans place themselves in direct relationship with forces believed to govern the world. When those moments were no longer needed, when the cycle closed, when the symbolic order shifted, leaving the structure standing may not only have been meaningless, but disruptive. Burial in this case was not erasure, but punctuation. This reveals a profound difference between ancient and modern thought. We tend to believe memory must be anchored in material form, stone markers, monuments, records. The builders of Göbekli Tepe appear to have believed the opposite, that memory lives in people, in ritual, in oral transmission, and in the controlled repetition of action, not necessarily in the prolonged physical presence of a structure. As long as the community remembered how to use the space, the structure remained alive, even if it was no longer visible. And when the community no longer needed that memory, in the same way, preserving the object could become more burden than benefit. Here we encounter a striking paradox. Göbekli Tepe has survived to the present precisely because it was carefully buried. The deliberate act of closure inadvertently protected it from erosion, destruction, and reuse as building material, a fate suffered by many structures built explicitly to last. This blurs the boundary between preservation and letting go. In some cases, not attempting to hold on may be the only way something can pass through time. Thus, when Göbekli Tepe challenges modern assumptions about value and durability, it does so not only for archaeology, but for us. It suggests that some cultures measured meaning not by years of existence, but by the completeness of a cycle. In that worldview, a structure built to disappear is not a failure of intelligence or labor, but an expression of a refined understanding of time, that everything has a beginning, and also a moment when it should be closed decisively, intentionally, and without regret. For the communities that created Göbekli Tepe, this site may not have been a place in the spatial sense, but an event in the temporal sense. It existed to serve a sequence of rituals, a phase in the community's life cycle, or a particular relationship with the natural and supernatural world. When that relationship changed, when the rituals were no longer needed, allowing the structure to continue existing, may not only have been meaningless, but incorrect. In many ancient traditions, sacred spaces were not allowed to linger outside their context. They had to be opened, and they had to be closed. One striking detail deserves attention. Göbekli Tepe shows no gradual progression from simple to complex. On the contrary, the earliest structures are the most elaborate. Later enclosures are smaller, simpler, less decorated. This suggests that Göbekli Tepe was not the beginning of a linear architectural evolution, but the culmination of a tradition that had existed earlier, perhaps in non-material form, in collective memory, oral ritual, symbolic practice. As that tradition transformed, the architecture transformed with it, until there was no longer a reason to continue. Within this context, the burial of Göbekli Tepe ceases to be a mystery and becomes a statement. It says this structure has completed its role. It does not need to be preserved. It does not need to be seen. What mattered was not the stone, but the actions that took place among those stones. When the actions ended, leaving behind an empty object could dilute the original meaning. A deep paradox lies here. Because Göbekli Tepe was carefully buried, it survives today. Because its builders did not intend it to endure, it outlasted many structures built for permanence. This forces us to reconsider the relationship between intention and outcome, between design and legacy. Perhaps in some cases, letting go at the right moment is the most effective form of preservation. To modern audiences, Göbekli Tepe is often presented as a revolution, evidence that religion preceded agriculture, that ritual drove settlement, that the spiritual world came before the material one. These interpretations have value, yet they still place Göbekli Tepe within a familiar evolutionary narrative, one in which everything leads toward us. But if we pause and listen to this site in its own language, it may be saying something else. Perhaps Göbekli Tepe was not meant to open a future, but to complete a very ancient relationship between humans and the world. In that relationship, humans did not see themselves as the center. They did not seek to control nature. They did not build to remain. They came, performed, and departed. The structure existed like a breath inhaled when the ritual began, exhaled when it ended. And when that breath dissolved into the air, there was nothing that needed to be kept. When we look at Göbekli Tepe today, we see a ruin. But for those who buried it, they may not have thought they were creating a ruin at all. They were simply closing a chapter. And in their world, closing a chapter was not a loss, but a condition for order to continue functioning. Eternal existence was not the goal. Timeliness was. Göbekli Tepe, therefore, is not merely an ancient structure. It is a quiet reminder that there are ways of living and ways of building that do not measure value by durability. Some things are created to disappear, and it is precisely in that disappearance that they achieve their fullest meaning. If Göbekli Tepe confuses us because it was built and then buried, then as we move into ancient Mesopotamia, we encounter another paradox no less profound. Here people built monumental structures, placed them at the heart of the city, dedicated them to the highest gods, and yet chose materials they knew would surely decay. In the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates, where rain was scarce and the sun burned for months on end, enormous step towers were raised not from eternal stone, but from sun-dried mud brick. And the most prominent of these was the ziggurat of Ur, a structure that did not merely worship the divine, but also revealed a very different way of thinking about time durability and the meaning of building. The ziggurat of Ur was built around the 21st century BCE under the reign of King Ur-Nammu and his son Shulgi in the city of Ur, one of the most important urban centers of Sumerian civilization, and later Akkad. From a distance, the ziggurat appears like a man-made mountain tier upon tier, stacked upward, climbing toward the sky in hard straight lines. It was not a place for large gatherings, not a palace, not a market. It was a structure with a single purpose: to lift sacred space up from the ground, bringing the temple of the god, Nana the moon god, closer to the heavens. In modern thinking, a sacred structure is almost automatically associated with the idea of eternity. We expect massive stone blocks enduring columns, materials chosen to withstand time, as if time itself were an enemy to be defeated. When we think of temples, we imagine structures that should not change forms, born to preserve their appearance across centuries. But the Sumerians, the first inhabitants of Mesopotamian cities, chose a different path, quiet yet consistent. And it is precisely this choice that makes the ziggurat of Ur a profound challenge to how we think about architecture and the sacred. The core of the ziggurat was not stone. It was made of sun-dried mud bricks, bonded with mud mixed with straw materials with a finite lifespan, prone to cracking, collapsing, and being eaten away by wind and rain. On the outside, the Sumerians added a layer of fired brick for protection, but that outer skin was thin and was not designed to prevent deterioration completely. This was not a technical failure, nor an unavoidable compromise. The crucial point often overlooked is that they were fully aware of it. Cuneiform texts surviving from the Sumerian period and later eras show that Mesopotamians understood the life cycle of building materials very well, and understood that a ziggurat, if left untouched, would crack, erode, and eventually collapse. They knew that such a structure required continuous care, periodic repairs, and even near total rebuilding after a certain number of generations. It is here that a familiar modern question reappears. Why not build with stone? Stone was not entirely absent from Mesopotamia. It existed in neighboring regions and could be quarried and transported with great effort. But stone was scarce, heavy, and difficult to integrate into a rapidly expanding urban system. Yet, if we stop at logistics alone, we miss a deeper layer of meaning. Because if the Sumerians truly believed that sacredness required absolute permanence, they would have found a way to obtain stone. The fact that they did not suggests something deeper. They did not view unchanging durability as a condition of the sacred. In the Sumerian worldview, the cosmos was not a static structure to be preserved unchanged, but a living order operating through cycles, formation, stability, decline, and renewal. The Tigris and Euphrates never stood still. They shifted course, deposited silt, and then swept it away. Harvests came and went. Cities flourished and weakened. Even the power of kings was understood as something that had to be continuously affirmed, not a permanent entitlement. In such a world, a structure's deterioration did not carry a purely negative meaning. On the contrary, it was a sign that the structure shared the fate of the world around it, participating in the common rhythm of time, rather than standing outside it. The ziggurat, therefore, was not imagined as a flawless object to be preserved in its original state. It resembled a body more than a block of stone. It was born, it endured, it wore down, and then it was healed. Each repair was not simply a patch over a crack, but a strongly symbolic act. When a king ordered the restoration of a ziggurat, he was not merely fixing architecture. He was declaring that the relationship between the city and the gods still held, that cosmic order was still being maintained. New bricks, often bearing the king's name and titles, were laid over older bricks like layers of time stacked upon one another, turning the structure into a physical chronicle of continuity and change. In this logic, deterioration was not a failure to be hidden, but the starting point of action. A cracking ziggurat called for human intervention, reminding people that order does not maintain itself. If everything were made of stone and never changed, the human role in keeping the world running would be diminished. Mud brick, by contrast, forced people to return to care, to recommit. It was precisely this controlled fragility that made the ziggurat a living part of urban and religious life, not a distant, motionless symbol. Compared to modern assumptions where we try to extend the lifespan of structures as far as possible and treat deterioration as the enemy, the Sumerian perspective seems paradoxical. Yet that paradox reveals a different kind of wisdom, that value does not necessarily lie in resisting time, but in conversing with time. A structure built of mud does not deny the sacred. It expresses sacredness in a way appropriate to a universe that is always in motion. And within that worldview, a ziggurat wearing down is not a sign of spiritual decline, but evidence that it is still alive alongside people, alongside the city, and alongside the never-stopping rhythm of history. The ziggurat of Ur was not built to stand still. It was built to be cared for, repaired, rebuilt. Each restoration was not only a technical act, but a political and religious ritual. When a king ordered repairs to the ziggurat, he did not merely preserve architecture. He reaffirmed the relationship between himself, the city, and the gods. New bricks were often inscribed with the king's name, like a declaration that order had been restored, that the link between heaven and earth still held. In this logic, decay is not the opposite of sacredness. It is the condition through which sacredness can be reactivated. Unlike Göbekli Tepe, where the structure was closed and buried, the ziggurat was a structure kept within the current of urban life. But being kept did not mean being unchanging. The ziggurat existed like a body. It aged, it needed healing, and sometimes it needed rebirth from old foundations. Mud brick, in this case, was not an inferior choice, but one aligned with a worldview that placed time at the center. A stone structure might challenge time. A mud structure must live with time. One detail is often overlooked. When discussing ziggurats, they were not designed for free human access. The stairways leading to the top were typically reserved for priests and the king. For most city inhabitants, the ziggurat was a massive presence, visible, palpable, but inaccessible. This emphasizes even more that its value did not lie in direct use, but in its existence as a symbolic anchor. When the ziggurat deteriorated, that deterioration was also visible. It became a reminder that cosmic order must be cared for, that the relationship between humans and gods does not sustain itself without action. Over time, as political power shifted and successive empires rose and fell, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria, many ziggurats were abandoned, dismantled, or buried by sand and silt. The ziggurat of Ur did not escape this fate. What remains today is an eroded core, truncated stairways, and traces of repairs layered one atop another. Yet those very layers, those architectural scars, tell a story very different from a story of collapse. They tell a story of continuation. Each layer of brick is a generation that arrived, repaired, prayed, and then departed. And then, if Göbekli Tepe raises the question of when a structure should end, then the ziggurat of Ur raises another, how a structure should grow old. In modern thinking, we try to prevent architecture from aging. We waterproof, reinforce, restore in order to return a building to its original state. The Sumerians did not try to reverse time. They accepted its passage and worked with it. A ziggurat did not need to look exactly as it did when new in order to remain meaningful. It only needed to continue to exist in the right relationship with the community and the gods. Perhaps because it was born within such a worldview, when the ziggurat was finally left behind, it did not feel like an unfinished project or a failed ambition. There is no sense that something went wrong, no sign of a project cut off halfway. Instead, the silence surrounding the ziggurat of Ur resembles the quiet after a ritual has been completed, when every necessary movement has been performed, every prayer has been spoken, and there is no longer any reason to continue. In modern thinking, we often look at abandoned structures with a sense of regret. We wonder why they were not preserved, why they were not kept in use, why a great achievement was left to time. But that perspective assumes the ultimate goal of architecture is to maintain presence. For the Sumerians, the goal may have been different. A ziggurat did not exist to continue indefinitely, but to serve a particular relationship between city and God, between king and cosmic order, between humans and the flow of time. When that relationship changed, when the city weakened or shifted, when the gods were no longer worshipped, in the same way maintaining the structure was no longer necessary. Notably, this ending did not occur suddenly. It was not like a building abandoned after war or catastrophe. The ziggurat grew old slowly. Its brick layers began to wear away. Its stairways became harder to use. Rituals became less frequent. Finally, no one climbed those steps anymore. Yet in that slow process, there is no sign of panic or desperate efforts to hold on. Decay was accepted as part of order, not something opposed to meaning, but the natural conclusion of that meaning. In Mesopotamian worldview, the gods were not fixed beings permanently bound to one place. They could favor a city for a time, then withdraw when order shifted. When that happened, sacred space also lost its function. The ziggurat, therefore, was not abandoned in the sense of being forgotten or despised. It simply ceased to be activated by ritual and human attention. And in a culture that understood the temporary nature of power and prosperity, allowing a structure to return to the earth was not a negative act, but an acknowledgement that a cycle had closed. A subtle but crucial difference appears here. In many modern societies, we try to maintain sacred buildings even when their original meaning has faded, as if physical presence itself could replace a lost spiritual relationship. The Sumerians seem not to have believed in that substitution. If the gods had withdrawn, if the city had changed course, keeping an empty architectural shell might have been seen as meaningless, even incorrect. A ziggurat without sacred function did not need to continue existing as a shadow of itself. In this light, the ziggurat's decay is not a tragic endpoint, but a form of completion. The structure lived long enough to perform its role. It was built, repaired, rebuilt, and cared for across generations. It witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. When all of that passed, letting it return to the earth was not waste, but a return to the proper order. This raises a difficult question for modern people. Must everything be preserved at all costs? Or are there cases where value lies in allowing something to end fully? The ziggurat of Ur suggests that in a world of constant change, meaning does not lie in the immortality of objects, but in their fit with the time in which they exist. A structure can be great, not because it still stands today, but because it once held a central role in the spiritual life of people, and knew how to withdraw when that role was no longer needed. Seen from that perspective, the ziggurat is not the ruin of an unfinished dream, but the trace of a cycle completed in rhythm. It reminds us that some civilizations did not seek to conquer time, but to live with time, accepting that every form, even the most sacred, has a moment when it should dissolve, so that order can continue to move in its own way. The ziggurat of Ur, viewed this way, is not a symbol of eternal ambition, but a symbol of humility before time. It shows a civilization that understood no structure, no matter how sacred, can stand outside the current of change. And rather than treating that as tragedy, they turned it into a principle of building. A principle that for modern people may be difficult to accept, yet deeply suggestive that sometimes architecture reaches its greatest depth, not when it lasts forever, but when it knows how to dissolve at the right time, in the right rhythm, and with the right meaning. If Göbekli Tepe teaches us about structures built to be closed, and the ziggurat of Ur shows us structures born to grow old, then when we step onto the windswept plains of prehistoric southern England, we encounter yet another way of understanding architecture and meaning. Here, among chalk ground and low skies, people raised structures they knew would vanish quickly, not after centuries, but after only a few rainy seasons. Today we call it Woodhenge, and what makes it remarkable is not its monumentality or durability, but its temporariness accepted from the very beginning. Woodhenge was not a stone structure. It did not use megaliths weighing tens of tons like Stonehenge, which lies not far away. Instead, Woodhenge was made of large wooden posts driven deep into the earth, arranged in multiple concentric circles. Wood, a living, warm, organic material, was something prehistoric people understood intimately. They knew wood rots. They knew it cracks. They knew that no matter how carefully the posts were selected, those timbers would eventually soften, fall, and dissolve back into the soil. There is no evidence they tried to prevent this. There are no traces of long-term preservation measures. This suggests that Woodhenge was not built to challenge time, but to synchronize with time. Placed within the broader context of Neolithic and early Bronze Age ritual construction in Britain, Woodhenge's logic becomes clearer. Salisbury Plain was not only home to Stonehenge, it was a complex ceremonial landscape with stone circles, earthworks, processional routes, and wooden structures that now survive only as stains and impressions in the ground. In the worldview of these communities, space was not a neutral plane. It was layered with meaning by the sun's direction, by the moon's cycles, by moments in the year when the boundary between humans and the cosmos felt thinner. Woodhenge, with its circular form and clear central axis, seems to have been raised to mark such moments, especially the solstitial points when the sun rises and sets in particular positions on the horizon. If we try to picture Woodhenge when it was still intact, what appears in the mind is not a structure standing still to be admired from afar, nor a silent symbol waiting for pilgrims to contemplate it. Instead, we see an active space, a space that truly exists only when people enter it and time strikes its rhythm. Woodhenge was not made to become a backdrop. It was like a delicate mechanism, a ritual stage that only opens when all necessary elements arrive together. The great wooden posts chosen from trunks that still carried the memory of life were driven deep into the earth in concentric rings, creating the sensation of stepping into an arranged forest. Not a natural forest, but a forest of order, where every timber held its place, where the spacing between posts was not random, but calculated to form a rhythm. When people entered, they did not remain outside as observers. They moved through the structure. Their bodies became part of the space surrounded by wood, by shadow, by openings that widened and narrowed with each step. Light played a central role in that experience. Unlike the flooding brightness of open ground light inside Woodhenge, was filtered cut and guided. When the sun was low, long slanting rays slipped between the wooden posts, drawing narrow bands of light that moved slowly across the earth. When the sun climbed higher, the posts' shadows shortened into denser shapes that shifted hour by hour. The space was not fixed. It constantly rearranged itself as if responding to the sky above. On special days of the year moments, the community remembered, through tradition, through observations made over many generations, the light may have reached an astonishing precision. When the sun rose or set at a predicted point, a shaft of light could have aligned straight through the posts passed through the circle and struck the exact center of the ritual space. In that moment, Woodhenge was not merely illuminated, it was activated. The geometry of wood, the movement of light, and the presence of people fused together, creating the feeling that this place was right for the moment, right for the cycle, right for humanity's position in the world. What matters is that this moment did not last. It may have existed for only minutes, perhaps even seconds. Yet it is precisely that brevity that made it sacred. Woodhenge was not designed to make the light stay. It was designed to let the light pass through. As the sun moved, as the axis of light shifted, the space changed instantly. What had just been switched on quietly dimmed again, leaving the posts in shadow, as if the structure were waiting for its next activation. Perhaps the next day, perhaps the next season, perhaps the next year, perhaps. Sound was also part of the experience. Wood is not silent like stone. When wind moved through the posts, the space could fill with rustling, low, resonant tones, sometimes even the faint tapping of timber against bindings or ornaments if such ritual elements existed. Footsteps on packed earth murmured voices chanting, or calls could have been held reflected and then dissolved within the circular form. In this sense, Woodhenge shaped not only light, but the entire sensory experience, an experience of the whole body, not only the eyes. Within this space, humans were not spectators. They were indispensable components. Without people, Woodhenge was only posts standing still. Without the right light at the right time, it was only an empty ring. Only when both were present, the human body and the sky's rhythm, did the structure truly happen. This suggests Woodhenge was not built to exist independently, but to depend on the moment. Its value did not lie in how long it stood, but in how many precise intersections it could create between humans and time. And precisely because of that, the fragility of the material was not a weakness. Wood, with its capacity to rot, to change color, to crack over the years, mirrored the true nature of this space. A space that did not resist time, but revealed time. As the posts weakened, as light began to slip through new gaps, as shadows no longer fell, as before, the community may have understood that the cycle was changing. The ritual space was no longer right in the same way. And when that happened, letting Woodhenge decay was not a loss, but an acknowledgement that the moment had passed. So Woodhenge, imagined in its intact form, was not a monument meant to stamp permanent human presence onto the landscape. It was a temporary meeting point between earth and sky, between light and shadow, between communal memory and cosmic rhythm. It was built to switch on at the right time, and it was allowed to disappear quietly when time shifted to another beat. And within this accepted temporariness, Woodhenge expresses a remarkably refined understanding of architecture, that sometimes a structure reaches its deepest meaning, not when it stands firm, but when it fades at the right moment, allowing space and time to continue their dialogue in their own way. The essential point is this: that moment does not last. It comes and goes like the seasons themselves. And when it passes, Woodhenge does not need to continue existing with the same intensity of meaning. The posts may remain for a while longer, but the structure's primary role has been fulfilled. In a worldview that sees time as cycles that repeat yet never perfectly match, rebuilding, replacing, or allowing a structure to decompose is not failure. It is a necessary adjustment, so that ritual space remains aligned with the present. Compared to Stonehenge, Woodhenge is often seen as a less durable version or a stepping stone in architectural development. But that view carries a modern assumption that evolution always moves from the temporary to the eternal, from wood to stone, from fragility to durability. Archaeological evidence suggests a more complex story. It is possible that wooden and stone structures existed side by side, each serving a different symbolic function. If stone was associated with ancestors, with death, with permanence, then wood, something that once lived, once grew, may have been associated with life movement and the present. Woodhenge, in this sense, was not the precursor of Stonehenge, but its complementary opposite. Woodhenge's temporariness is not only in its easily decaying material, but is also evident in how people used it and left it. No archaeological evidence suggests it was a place of permanent residence. There are no traces of domestic hearths, no accumulated trash pits, no auxiliary structures for everyday life. Woodhenge was not where people lived. It was where people came and then went. And that deliberate rhythm of coming and going shaped the entire meaning of the site. The communities who built Woodhenge do not seem to have tried to make it the center of daily life. Instead, it appears as a space kept empty most of the time, waiting for special occasions in the year. When that time arrived, perhaps a solstice day, a seasonal rite, or an event marking a major change in the community's life cycle, people gathered. They came from many directions, carrying stories, offering shared memory, and perhaps songs passed down through generations. In that moment, Woodhenge became alive, not because it was crowded, but because it was activated for its intended purpose. What is notable is that after the ritual, there is no sign the community tried to stay or leave permanent marks. There was no expansion, no layers of architecture added over time to improve the structure. This suggests Woodhenge was not understood as a project that needed to develop, but as a space already complete in its own limits. When the ritual ended, people left, leaving the wooden posts standing in the wind, needing no guard, needing no continuous presence to maintain meaning. In an oral society, memory is not anchored to enduring objects in the way we are accustomed to today. It does not need stone to stand in for remembrance. Memory lives in stories told again beside the fire, in songs repeated in rites, reenacted in cycles. Knowing how to perform a ritual, when to perform it, and who holds which role matters far more than preserving a physical structure as proof. Woodhenge, therefore, did not need to last forever in order to remain present in the community's spiritual life. It only needed to exist long enough to shape memory, and then memory could carry it onward. This choice reflects a deep trust in human beings as the holders of meaning. Rather than freezing memory in stone, these communities believed memory should be nurtured through action. Each time a rite was repeated, whether at Woodhenge itself or in another temporarily constructed space, memory was not only recalled, but renewed. It shifted, slightly adapted to present conditions, yet retained its core. That flexibility is precisely what allows tradition to survive through time, even when the physical structure has disappeared. Over time, the wooden posts of Woodhenge may have rotted to the point where they were no longer suitable for use. But that does not necessarily mean the rituals ended. The rites may have moved to a new wooden structure in another location, or been adjusted to suit changing conditions. In this context, Woodhenge was not the only place, but one of many temporary expressions of a longer tradition. When one expression no longer fit, it was allowed to vanish to make room for another, without tragedy, without regret. This reveals a major difference between prehistoric communities and modern people in how memory is treated. We tend to fix memory into objects, fearing that without material traces, everything will be forgotten. The communities who built Woodhenge appear not to have carried that fear. They believed that as long as the story was still told, as long as the rite was still performed, even by a small, chosen group, memory remained alive. Durable material was not a condition for memory to exist. Sometimes the temporariness of material is precisely what prevents memory from turning to stone. Thus, Woodhenge's temporariness is not a sign of underinvestment or lack of vision. It is the result of a deliberate cultural choice to place trust in collective memory, in oral tradition, and in the human capacity to carry meaning with them. Woodhenge, in this view, was not lost when the wooden posts decayed. It continued not in earth or timber, but in the moments when the community gathered again, repeated familiar actions, and once more stepped into a brief yet profound dialogue with time and the cosmos. A subtle paradox lies here. A wooden structure, fragile, perishable, can produce experiences more vivid than stone. Wood makes sound when wind blows. It creaks when temperatures shift. It carries the scent of resin and damp earth. All of this binds the ritual space to the human body. And as the posts slowly rotted, that change could be felt not as loss, but as a sign that time had passed and a new cycle was approaching. When Woodhenge finally disappeared from the surface of the land, no one lost it in the modern sense. There is no evidence of grief or efforts at preservation. What remained were the post holes' silent traces of what had once stood there. Those traces allow archaeologists today to reconstruct the story. But for the people who built Woodhenge, the structure's disappearance from sight likely did not mean its disappearance from their world. It fulfilled its role in the right moment, in the right season, in the right cycle. Woodhenge therefore asks a very different question from the two chapters before it. Not when a structure should end or how it should grow old, but does a structure need to last longer than the moment it serves? In modern thinking, the answer is almost always yes. But Woodhenge suggests that some cultures answered differently. For them, a structure's quick dissolution did not reduce its value. On the contrary, it was that brevity that preserved the sacred, prevented ritual from becoming an empty habit, and allowed each rebuilding if it happened to remain a truly meaningful act. Seen from this angle, Woodhenge was not a failure of technique, but a conscious choice. It was the architecture of a season, of a moment, of a temporary alignment between humans and the cosmos. And in a world that is always moving, perhaps it is precisely such structures, born to disappear, that most honestly reflect how prehistoric people understood time, not as something to conquer, but as something to walk with in rhythm, and then release when necessary. If Woodhenge is the architecture of a moment, then when we leave the mist and wind of Salisbury Plain and move down toward the Mediterranean to the sunlit limestone island of Crete, we encounter another understanding of impermanence, subtler, more complex, and tightly woven into urban life. Here the Minoans built vast palace complexes, multi-level structures full of color and motion. Yet what makes these palaces truly distinctive is not their beauty or complexity, but a quiet fact: they were not designed to resist earthquakes completely, even though the Minoans lived in one of the most seismically active regions of the Mediterranean. The most prominent of these was the Palace of Knossos, the largest center of Minoan civilization. Knossos does not resemble the royal palaces we tend to imagine in modern terms. It has no massive fortification walls, no monumental defensive gate, no clear separation between inside and outside. Instead, it is an open, spreading space with a broad central courtyard, winding corridors, multi-level staircases, light wells, and countless functional rooms flowing into one another like a living body. From a distance, Knossos does not look like a fortress. It looks like a miniature city where ritual administration, production, and everyday life are interwoven. And it is precisely within this openness that we begin to see the Minoan way of thinking. Crete lies on the boundary of tectonic plates, where earthquakes are a familiar part of life. The Minoans could not have been unaware of this. Archaeological layers show that Knossos and other palaces, such as Phaistos Malea and Zakros, were repeatedly destroyed by earthquakes and then rebuilt, repaired, expanded. Yet rather than shifting toward a more closed, heavier architectural style to withstand disaster, the Minoans continued to build in the same way stone walls combined with timber wooden columns set on stone bases, flexible structures that could sway. These features helped prevent total collapse, but they did not prevent damage. And what matters is this: they seem to have accepted that. Minoan palaces were not designed to be unchanging. They were designed to live with an unstable landscape. Each time an earthquake struck, a portion of the structure collapsed, but it did not bring the entire system to an end. Instead, damaged parts were repaired, restructured, sometimes reassigned in function. Over time, Knossos became a gathering of historical layers stacked upon one another with no final version and no perfect form. It resembled a manuscript constantly being written with passages erased, revised, and rewritten directly on top of earlier lines. As we look more deeply into the structure of Minoan palaces, we begin to realize that this not resisting earthquakes was not a technical deficiency, but a systemic choice. Minoan architects did not try to create heavy, closed, immovable blocks. Instead, they fragmented space into many smaller units linked by corridors, stairways, and open courtyards. When the ground shook, energy was not compressed into a single point, but dispersed throughout the entire structure. One part fell, but another remained standing. Collapse, therefore, was rarely total. It was like a crack in a living body, painful but not fatal. The wooden columns so characteristic of Minoan architecture are a clear proof of this mindset. Unlike stone columns, wood has elasticity. It can bend, slightly sway, and then return to place when the shaking passes. Setting wooden columns on stone bases rather than fixing them rigidly allowed the entire building to breathe with the earth. From a modern perspective, this might appear less durable, but in Crete's continual seismic environment, it was a smart adaptation, accepting movement rather than denying it. This flexibility appears not only in structure, but in how the Minoans organized living space. The palaces do not have a single axis of power, no massive throne room dominating the entire complex. Even the throne room at Knossos, if it can truly be called that, is small, almost modest, compared to the whole. This suggests the palace was not designed to glorify an unchanging individual, but to serve a continuously functioning system, storerooms, workshops, ritual areas, gathering spaces. When one part of the system was damaged by an earthquake, other parts could still operate or could be adjusted to take on new roles. Light and air also played an important role in this architectural philosophy. Light wells, inner courts, and open corridors did more than provide ventilation. They reduced the feeling of being trapped inside a sealed block of architecture. In a world that shook, often openness may have carried deep psychological meaning. It created the impression that people were not imprisoned in stone, that they remained connected to the sky, to sea winds, to nature's rhythm, even when the ground beneath them was unstable. Rebuilding after earthquakes did not aim to return the palace to an original state. Each reconstruction was an adaptation. Rooms were rearranged, pathways shifted, some spaces disappeared, others emerged. Over centuries, Minoan palaces became multi-layered structures of time where past and present overlapped without needing to merge into a single form. This shows the Minoans were not obsessed with preserving an initial shape. For them, what mattered more was maintaining function and life rhythm, even if form had to change. Perhaps because they lived so long in such an environment, the Minoans developed a very different attitude toward risk and uncertainty. Earthquakes were not seen as a sign the world was wrong, but as part of natural order. Architecture, rather than trying to deny this, became a tool through which humans negotiated instability. The palace was not a fortress against nature, but an intermediary space where people learned to exist in a world that never stood completely still. When we look back at the decline of Minoan civilization, we often search for a single cause, a volcanic eruption, a series of great earthquakes, or invasion from outside forces. But perhaps more striking is how the palaces had been psychologically preparing for decline from very early on. By not building under the illusion of immortality, the Minoans accepted that every center of power, every social structure could change or vanish. Their architecture, therefore, did not speak in the tone of defying time, but in the tone of conversing with time. The ruins that remain today, broken stairways, cracked walls, collapsed corridors, do not tell only a story of collapse. They also tell a story of a civilization that repeatedly stood up, repaired, and continued living. They remind us that there are ways of building that do not aim to create an eternal endpoint, but aim to create the ability to continue. And in the ever-shifting world of ancient Crete, that ability may have mattered more than any promise of permanence. This reflects a worldview very different from the defensive mindset of many contemporary civilizations. The Minoans do not seem to have viewed nature as an enemy to be conquered. They did not build walls to isolate themselves. They did not try to seal their living space shut. On the contrary, their palaces opened to light to sea winds to color. Brilliant frescoes depicted bull-leaping flowers, sea creatures, a world overflowing with motion and life. In that world, earthquakes were not absolute catastrophe, but a reality to live with like storm season or the changing sea. That is why when a Minoan palace collapsed, it did not leave behind the feeling of total failure. Archaeological evidence shows that after each major destruction, the Minoans returned, cleared debris, and built again, sometimes on a larger scale, more complex than before. There is no sign they tried to lock architecture into a form that would prevent collapse from happening again. This suggests they did not see collapse as something to eliminate completely, but as a stage in the life cycle of a structure. One detail is especially thought-provoking. Minoan palaces do not bear the stamp of absolute centralized power, the way Egyptian or Mesopotamian palaces often do. There are no colossal king statues, no clearly separated space reserved for a supreme individual. This suggests that the palace was not merely a symbol of power, but a coordinating center for the community. When that center was damaged by earthquakes, the community could adapt, restructure, and continue. Architecture, therefore, was not the sole foundation of order, but only one part of a wider network of social and spiritual life. In the end, Minoan civilization declined, not in a straight line, not in a single moment, but through overlapping disruptions. Earthquakes continued through generations, damaging infrastructure. The eruption of Thera shook trade networks and confidence in the world's stability. Shifts in exchange routes threw economic centers out of rhythm, and then outside intrusion, whether gradual or sudden, closed an old order. But when we stand before the ruined palaces today, what dominates is not the tragedy of an immortal ambition defeated. What comes into focus instead is the trace of a long-standing habit, the habit of rebuilding. The stacked architectural layers at Knossos, Phaistos, and Malea reveal something consistent. Each collapse became an adjustment. There was no desperate attempt to freeze the old form. Spaces were reorganized, routes reopened differently, functions shifted to suit new conditions. This suggests the Minoans did not view form itself as sacred. For them, sacredness lay in the ability to keep functioning in life, finding its way forward, even as physical structure changed. This familiarity with rebuilding also reflects a deep psychological posture toward risk. On Crete, the ground did not promise long-term stability. In that context, pursuing architectural forms that could never fall would only create the illusion of safety. The Minoans chose another path, accepting that collapse would occur and reducing the cost of collapse by fragmenting space using flexible materials and maintaining functional networks that could be restructured quickly. Instead of asking, how do we never fall, they seem to have asked, how do we make sure that when we fall, everything can still continue? This also explains why Minoan palaces do not resemble symbols of unchanging power. There are no triumphal monuments, no axis of authority dominating the whole. The palace is a junction where ritual production, governance, and social life meet. When one junction is damaged, the network can reroute. Meaning does not depend on preserving a single shape, but on maintaining connections between people and their environment. So, when Minoan civilization gradually withdrew from the stage of history, what remained was not the feeling of a failed project, but the imprint of a way of living. The ruined palaces do not tell a story of helplessness before nature. They tell a story of flexibility in the face of change. They show a society accustomed to repair, accustomed to writing new lines on old foundations, accustomed to letting form change as long as the rhythm of life could continue. The lesson here is not found in pinpointing the precise cause of decline, but in how the Minoans prepared themselves for change very early on. They did not place their entire wager on the permanence of stone and mortar. They wagered on the community's capacity to adapt. And because of that, when the old order dissolved, it did not leave behind a meaningless void. It left a spiritual legacy that architecture, like society, does not have to be unchanging to have value. Value may lie in knowing when to keep, when to alter, and when to let go. Looking at broken stairways and collapsed corridors under Crete's late afternoon light, one can feel this. Not regret for a lost form, but respect for a civilization that understood very clearly that living space will always change, and that the deepest meaning lies not in resisting change, but in walking with it again and again until the cycle closes. Minoan palaces, therefore, represent a very different approach to impermanence. Not building to vanish quickly, like Woodhenge, and not building to age slowly, like the ziggurat, but building with the understanding that collapse will happen, and that what matters is not avoiding it at any cost, but ensuring it does not end everything. In a world that constantly shook, the Minoans chose not to confront the earth, but to yield with its rhythm. And in that yielding, their architecture found another kind of durability, not the durability of matter, but the durability of continuing to live. If the Minoan palaces show a civilization accustomed to rebuilding, then when we cross the ocean to North America, we encounter another kind of impermanence, quieter, less showy, but no less profound. In the land that is now the state of Louisiana, along the banks of the ancient Mississippi, there exists a vast complex of earthen architecture built roughly between 1700 and 1100 BCE, Poverty Point. What makes Poverty Point remarkable is not the height of its mounds, nor the scale of collective labor required to create them, but a clear paradox. This is a city built without the intention of being lived in for long. Seen from above, Poverty Point does not look like a settlement so much as an idea drawn onto the ground. 6 curving earthen ridges bending in broad arcs form concentric rings that open toward one direction, like a deliberate gesture enclosing a central space so wide it feels almost empty. Between the ridges rise high mounds, including one large mound whose shape calls to mind a bird in flight, not as decorative symbolism, but as an accent, a visual anchor within a carefully arranged whole. This entire layout does not speak the language of houses, rooms, or streets in any familiar sense. It speaks of order, orientation, and emptiness. The scale of the construction is undeniable. Millions of cubic meters of soil were moved by handbasket, by basket, small load by small load, trip after repeated trip, in a society without metal tools for rapid digging, without wheels for heavy transport, and without draft animals for hauling and leveling. That volume of labor required long-term coordination, social agreement, and a purpose important enough to bring people back again and again over many years. And yet it is precisely here that the paradox appears. All that effort was not meant to produce a place of permanent residence. When archaeologists dug deeper into each soil layer and each trace of daily life, the picture that emerged ran contrary to what the scale might suggest. There are no solid house foundations. Compacted surfaces indicate activity, but not the long-term accumulation of family architecture. There is no stable system of hearths with thick, continuous layers of ash, only discontinuous traces, as if fires were lit and extinguished many times, but never became the center of everyday domestic life. There is no large cemetery tied to daily living, a crucial sign that people did not remain here long enough to die here. That absence is not a gap caused by missing data. It is a consistent pattern. What has been found: stone tools from far-off regions, non-local materials, traces of exchange, suggests instead that Poverty Point was a junction in a much larger network. People came here carrying objects, stories, and relationships. They stayed long enough to trade, to participate in ritual, to reaffirm communal bonds. And then they left. There was no attempt to turn the curving ridges into permanent house platforms. No effort to fill the central space with fixed architecture. The emptiness was preserved as if emptiness itself were what was necessary. This forces us to view Poverty Point through a different lens. It is not an unfinished city, nor a half-abandoned urban project. It is an intentional space where the lack of permanent residence is part of the social design. The curved ridges may have supported temporary structures, tents, shelters sufficient for gatherings, but not encouraging permanent settlement. The concentric layout guided people's movement, leading them into and out of the central space, but did not hold them there. In the context of complex hunter-gatherer societies, where mobility is a condition of survival, such a center carries deep meaning. It allows a community to assemble without losing the ability to disperse. It creates temporary order without imposing long-term settlement. And it avoids a major risk. If a center becomes too fixed, too much of a place that stays, it can rigidify the mobile network that helps a community adapt to changing environments. So the absence of houses, hearths, and cemeteries is not a deficiency. It is evidence of a choice. Poverty Point was built to welcome people, not to keep them. Its value lay in its ability to organize moments of ordered meeting, where hundreds, even thousands of people could be present together, act together, and then leave together without creating a deserted city. In a world where memory and tradition were carried by people not anchored in stone, that space fulfilled its role precisely by not requiring residence. Seen again from above, the abstract diagram of Poverty Point is therefore not the blueprint of a place to live, but the map of a rhythm: arrive, gather, depart. And within that rhythm, the immense scale of labor was not meant to create material permanence, but to ensure that each time the community returned, the space remained clear enough, familiar enough, right enough for ritual and reconnection to be activated once more. This compels us to revise our perspective at a fundamental level. Poverty Point is not a city in the modern sense, a place where people are born, grow up, work daily, and die within the same space. It does not operate according to the logic of continuous residence. Instead, Poverty Point resembles a cyclical gathering center, an appointment point activated at very specific times, and then left quiet when those times passed. People did not cling to this place. They arrived at the right moment and left at the right moment. Archaeological studies reinforce this interpretation through small but consistent details. Ash traces do not accumulate into thick, continuous layers as they do in long-term settlements. They appear in scattered patches, as if fires were lit only on certain occasions. Stone tools come from many distant regions, signs of a broad exchange network, yet they do not show wear consistent with daily on-site use. Domestic remains are intermittent, not forming a continuous rhythm of life. All of this suggests that activity at Poverty Point occurred in waves, perhaps aligned with a major hunting season, a season of trade, or large-scale rituals in which a wider community participated. When the season passed, the space was not maintained in the modern sense. It returned to quiet. The earthen ridges remained shaping the landscape, but were not filled with houses or daily routines. The large central space, rather than being maximized, was kept open as if that openness were essential for waiting until the next activation. Here, architecture did not force people to remain. It allowed them to return. In that context, the earthen architecture of Poverty Point begins to reveal its own internal logic, a logic very different from structures built for eternal survival. Earth is not the material of immortality. It is soft, easily eroded, easily reshaped by wind and rain, and if one wants it to retain its form over long stretches of time, it requires continuous care. But Earth is also a material that is flexible and honest. It responds immediately to the environment. It records rain, wind, footsteps, and time without concealment. In the worldview of Poverty Point's builders, perhaps that honesty was precisely what mattered. Choosing earth rather than stone or wood suggests they were not trying to defy time. Stone can stand for ages, but it carries the idea of fixity. Wood can feel alive, but it is tied to a short life cycle and continual replacement. Earth, by contrast, stands between those extremes. It allows people to create large forms durable enough to guide space and action, yet fragile enough not to impose permanence. When wind and rain wore down the ridges, their shapes changed slowly, not as destruction, but as a reminder that time had passed since the last gathering. For that reason, Poverty Point's architecture was not intended to freeze a historical moment. It created a ritual and social setting large enough to gather a community, clear enough for people to know where they were, how they should move, where they should assemble, yet not required to remain perfectly intact for centuries. If a ridge eroded, it could be rebuilt. If the shape shifted, the community could adjust ritual practice accordingly. Meaning did not depend on preserving every physical detail, but on the ability to reactivate the space when needed. Here we see a subtle mastery in how ancient people managed the relationship between humans, architecture, and time. Poverty Point did not force a community to attach itself to a single place. It did not demand continuous presence to prove its value. It only needed to remain clear enough that when people returned, order would be recognized immediately. The familiar curves, the open central space, the mounds as reference points, all of these functioned as a minimal material memory, just enough to trigger the social memory carried within people themselves. So when we view Poverty Point as a cyclical gathering center, the absence of long-term residence no longer looks like a lack. On the contrary, it is the necessary condition for the space to perform its role. A place can carry deep meaning, not because it keeps people, but because it knows when to open and when to remain quiet. And in the choice of earth as a material durable enough, yet fragile enough, Poverty Point's builders left a quiet but unmistakable architectural philosophy, building not to fight time, but to move with time in the rhythm of meetings and partings. The way the community interacted with this space also reflects that impermanence. The earthen ridges may have served as platforms for light structures, temporary tents, shelters erected when needed and dismantled when people left. The wide central space may have hosted rituals, exchanges, or rare collective events. When everything ended, people did not leave behind a deserted city in the modern sense. They left an ordered trace enough that on the next return, the space could be reactivated in the same way. In a complex hunter-gatherer society where networks of relationships stretched across a wide region, having a center like Poverty Point was not meant to create fixity, but to coordinate movement. It was a rendezvous point, not a destination. Its value lay in gathering people for a limited period, enabling material and spiritual exchange, and then releasing them back into the mobile cycle that was the core of life. Staying too long could have broken the very order it supported. Notably, when Poverty Point gradually lost its central role, there is no evidence of dramatic collapse. no violent destruction layer, no traces showing the community fought to keep it at all costs. Activities simply thinned. The ridges began to erode. The central space fell silent. But like the structures earlier in this story, that ending does not resemble failure. It resembles a completed cycle. Poverty Point therefore raises a very different question from the cities we know in history. If a space is built mainly for people to leave, then by what standard should we evaluate it? Not by the durability of its materials, not by the number of generations living there continuously, but by its ability to create meaningful moments of connection and then to allow the community to disperse again without breaking the social order. Seen that way, Poverty Point is not a failed attempt at urbanization, but another path, a way of organizing social space suited to a world where movement was a condition of survival. It shows that some cultures did not measure architectural value by permanence, but by timeliness and function. A city can be great not because it holds people, but because it knows when to let them go. And in the broader context of this series, Poverty Point continues a familiar thread that many ancient works were not built to last in a material sense. They were built to serve a role during a particular phase of communal life. When that phase passed, allowing the work to fade was not forgetting, but a form of respect for a cycle completed. If Poverty Point is a center built to welcome and then send people on their way, then when we step into the low plains of ancient Cambodia, we meet an entirely different model, a system built to run continuously with a precision so tight that if the rhythm slips even slightly, the entire social structure begins to tremble. This is Angkor, not merely a complex of temples, but a colossal hydraulic machine, spread across hundreds of square kilometers, designed to coordinate water harvests, population, and power for centuries. When Angkor is mentioned, the images that usually rise in our minds are the symmetrical stone towers of Angkor Wat, the solemn stone faces of Bayon, looking out toward the four directions, or ancient walls held fast by the roots of tropical forest, like reminders made visible by time itself. Those images are powerful symbolic, and they make it easy to believe that stone is the soul of Angkor. But that is only the surface, the part we can see. The core of Angkor does not lie in sandstone. It lies in water, in how water was gathered, held guided and distributed according to a rhythm upon which the entire society depended. The Khmer Empire formed and grew within a landscape of paradox. Each year, the Southeast Asian sky pours down an enormous amount of rain, but nearly all of it falls within only a few months of the wet season. The rest of the year is a long, dry season, when sun draws the ground empty, when rice, if it is not supplied, cracks and dies standing in the field. Under such conditions, water is both a gift and a threat. Too much water destroys farmland and washes away infrastructure. Too little water leads to hunger and instability. Angkor's life, therefore, did not depend on whether water existed at all, but on whether water arrived at the right time, in the right place, in the right amount. To solve that problem, the Khmer did not build a single structure. They engineered an entire hydraulic landscape. They dug canals to connect watersheds, built embankments to redirect flow, and created enormous reservoirs barrage to store wet season water for use during the dry months. These reservoirs were not merely basins. They were the memory of the seasons recording last year's rain in order to nourish the year that followed. On modern maps, especially through LiDAR data, that network appears like a circulatory system, canals, as vessels, reservoirs, as the heart rice fields, as consuming organs, all operating within one unified rhythm. That rhythm was not accidental. It was bound tightly to power and belief. The Khmer king was not only a ruler, he was the guarantor of cosmic order an order reflected in smooth-flowing water-stable harvests, and rituals performed on schedule. When water was regulated seamlessly, power was reinforced. When water malfunctioned, power shook. Angkor's stone, therefore, did not stand alone. Every temple, every ceremonial axis was linked to surrounding canals and reservoirs, as if religious architecture were the public face of a sophisticated water governance system, working quietly behind it. For many centuries, that system operated with astonishing success. It allowed Angkor to expand its population, maintain agricultural surplus, and build the monumental stone works that we still admire today. But that success carried an unspoken condition: every component had to keep perfect time. Canals had to be dredged before silt choked them. Embankments had to be reinforced before the rains returned. Reservoir levels had to be adjusted to match the coming dry season. The larger and more precise the system became, the less flexibility it retained. A few links falling out of Phase A canal segment, filling in a levee, breaking after an extreme storm, and the chain reaction began. Here we encounter a form of fragility unlike anything in the previous chapters. Angkor is not fragile because of its material. Its stone is resilient. Angkor is fragile because of dependence. Water had to be controlled continuously across generations through collective labor and accumulated knowledge. When climate began to swing, long droughts alternating with extreme rainfall, the system faced not only natural pressure, but social pressure as well. Population movement, declining, maintenance. Labor delayed administrative decisions. Every small delay pushed the rhythm slightly further off, and once the rhythm slipped, stone began to speak differently. The temples still stood, but water no longer arrived evenly. The reservoirs still existed, but water levels no longer matched the seasons. The fields still spread wide, but yields became unstable. The gap between enduring form and lived reality widened little by little. Angkor did not fall in a single night. It lost its rhythm, a slow, cumulative process that was difficult to reverse. Looking back, we might say that Angkor's core was not an ambition to conquer nature, but an ambition to synchronize nature with society at a scale rarely seen before. That ambition succeeded brilliantly for a long time, but when the underlying conditions changed, a system optimized for stability became a system that struggled to adapt. Angkor is therefore not only a story of stone and jungle, but a story of water and rhythm, of how high a civilization can rise when it controls the flow, and how it can drift when that flow no longer follows the old beat. Within the arc of this series, Angkor occupies a special place. It shows that some creations are not built to last, not because they are weak, but because they are too precise. When that precision is broken, silence does not arrive as a crash, but as a gradual withdrawal, leaving stone standing among the trees and water finding another path. The Khmer answered that challenge with a bold vision, not with a single structure, but by restructuring the entire landscape so that water could become something predictable and governable. They dug canals across the plains, built dams to block and redirect flow, and created enormous reservoirs called baray, artificial bodies of water so vast that from a distance they resemble inland seas. From higher ground in the north and northeast, wet season, water was collected, held within the baray, and then guided slowly through a network of canals to feed rice fields and settlements throughout the dry season. This was not a crude assault on nature. It was an attempt at synchronization, aligning the rhythm of water, the rhythm of the seasons, and the rhythm of society until they matched. When we view Angkor on a modern map, especially through LiDAR, the city appears like a living body. The canals are arteries, the baray are regulating organs. The earthen embankments are a spine that holds the shape together. Each component has its own role, yet none exists independently. A single canal clogged with sediment can alter water levels across an entire downstream region. A weakened embankment can send floodwater into residential areas. For that reason, the system demanded constant care knowledge accumulated over generations and a labor force large enough to maintain countless small details. This was not static architecture. It was living infrastructure running day by day, reacting to rain, sun, and even the smallest shifts in the environment. For many centuries, that living infrastructure performed astonishingly well. It created rare agricultural stability within an extreme climate, enabling Angkor to produce rice reliably and sustain a population of unprecedented size in the region. That stability was not merely a matter of food, it was the foundation of power. When fields were irrigated on time, harvest proceeded smoothly, and reserves were sufficient for the dry season. Society could redirect resources toward other aims, construction, ritual administration. Water in that sense became the bloodstream of politics. The Khmer king's authority was bound to that bloodstream. The king was not only the head of the earthly realm, he was seen as an intermediary between cosmic order and social order. When water flowed through the right channels and harvests were strong, it signaled that the link remained intact. When water failed through drought or flood, faith in order began to waver. Within that worldview, the stone temples were not only places of worship, they were visible indicators of a system operating smoothly. Each time a new temple was built or expanded, it was not only a religious act, but an implicit declaration. Water has been controlled, harvests are abundant, and order still stands. Sandstone was carved with exquisite care. Ceremonial axes were aligned with precision. All of it reflected the belief that the world sat in its proper place. Stone architecture thus became the facade of stability, the visible surface of a massive water machine working behind it. The subtlety lies here. The Khmer understood that stone might endure, but water decides. Temples were therefore not separate from hydraulic infrastructure. They were placed in close relationship with surrounding canals and reservoirs. Sacred space and technical space interwove, reflecting a worldview in which religion, agriculture, and governance were not separate domains, but different faces of the same order. That fusion helped Angkor reach its peak. Yet it also planted the seed of a distinctive fragility. When every symbol of authority depends on water maintaining perfect rhythm, any disruption in the hydraulic system becomes more than a technical issue. It becomes a symbolic issue, an issue of belief, and ultimately an issue of politics. When water no longer obeys the old order, stone remains, but the meaning stone once reflected begins to crack. For that reason, Angkor's golden age is not only a story of magnificent temples, but a story of a society that wagered its future on controlling water at an unprecedented scale. For centuries, that wager yielded prosperity and stability. But it also created a strict condition order existed only as long as the rhythm of water remained flawless. And once that rhythm began to slip even slightly, the entire system from rice fields to temples, from daily life to sacred symbolism, began to feel the shift. But it is precisely here that we begin to see another form of fragility, not the fragility of material, but the fragility of complexity. The more sophisticated a system becomes, the more it depends on every component functioning in time. Angkor was not built to withstand prolonged desynchronization. It was optimized for a relatively stable climatic pattern. And when that pattern changed, the system began to respond in ways that were not easily reversible. Climate and sediment research suggests that from the 14th to the 15th centuries, This region experienced severe volatility, long droughts interwoven with episodes of extreme rainfall. Under those conditions, Angkor's hydraulic system faced two opposing pressures at once. When drought arrived, canals and reservoirs lacked sufficient water to maintain the needed flow. When heavy rains came suddenly, the force of water broke embankments, filled canals with silt, and damaged the delicate regulating structures designed for normal conditions. What matters is the system did not collapse immediately. It failed gradually. A canal here filled in, a dam there broke. But because every component was linked, a small malfunction could trigger a chain reaction. Water no longer reached where it was needed. Rice fields lost their supply. People began to move. As population declined, maintaining the system, which required continuous collective labor, became harder. And as maintenance weakened, deterioration accelerated. Unlike Göbekli Tepe, or Woodhenge Angkor, was not closed by a clear ritual act. It drifted out of balance. And because it was built as a continuous machine, that drift had no natural stopping point. There was no moment when the community declared Angkor's role is complete. Instead, the system continued to operate in a steadily less effective state until sustaining it was no longer socially or economically possible. Here we meet one of history's great paradoxes. Angkor did not fail because it lacked technique, but because it was too successful in technique. It was optimized so tightly that it retained too little flexibility to adapt quickly to long-term climatic change. Its canals were designed for specific flows. Its reservoirs had finite capacity. When extremes exceeded those bounds, the system could not adjust the way a mobile society or cyclical gathering center might. It became trapped within its own complexity. This is also reflected in Angkor's stone architecture. Sandstone is durable, heavy, and used to produce temples that speak in the language of permanence. Yet those temples depended entirely on the surrounding earth and water infrastructure. When water no longer flowed correctly, stone remained, but its meaning hollowed. The temple stood, but the community no longer had the resources to sustain ritual at the old scale. The distance between physical form and lived life grew larger and larger. When we look at Angkor today, we are easily captivated by the image of jungle swallowing temples as though nature won. But that view misses something more important. Angkor was not defeated by nature in a single battle. It lost its rhythm. A system built to run continuously could not find a way to pause, recalibrate, or shrink itself in an orderly manner when conditions changed. And in the world of complex systems, losing rhythm is often more dangerous than sudden collapse. Compared with earlier chapters, Angkor represents a very different kind of impermanence. It was not built to vanish quickly. It was not built to accept dissolution as part of a ritual cycle. It was built to maintain stability for as long as possible. Yet that very choice created a weakness when stability itself no longer existed. The system did not know what else it could become. So Angkor is not only a story of an empire's decline, but a lesson in the limits of optimization. It shows that a structure or a society can fail not because it is weak, but because it depends too completely on everything proceeding correctly. In a shifting world, survival is not only a matter of strength or scale, but of the ability to adjust rhythm, contract restructure, or even withdraw when necessary. In the end, Angkor did not vanish entirely. Some temples remained in use. Some communities continued living around the region. But Angkor, as an integrated urban hydraulic system, ended. And when we stand before drained reservoirs and silted canals, we are not only looking at ruins of the past. We are seeing the trace of a social and architectural choice building a perfect machine for the present, but not one supple enough for the future. Within the arc of this series, Angkor is a reminder that not every structure not built to last is fragile because of its materials. Some are fragile because of rhythm. And when that rhythm breaks, even the most monumental systems can drift into silence, not in a single tragic moment, but through a long process of desynchronization until silence becomes the new state. If Angkor is a system that died by falling out of rhythm, then the final story of this series takes us somewhere far more remote, more isolated, and much quieter. Rapa Nui, or Easter Island. Here the great works did not collapse because of violent natural disasters, nor did they dissolve because the system was too complex. They became out of place, built for a social and ecological world that no longer existed. The most familiar image of Rapa Nui is the enormous stone moai, large heads, long bodies, standing on stone platforms called ahu, facing inward toward the island. They suggest permanence, like silent sentinels that have stood for centuries. But that impression can be misleading. Moai were not erected to stand forever in the modern sense. They were created to function within a very specific social context, where each statue was a link in a network connecting ancestors' land and the living community. In the worldview of ancient Rapa Nui, the island was not simply an island. It was an ancestral space, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was not severed, but continuously maintained through ritual land and architecture. In that setting, moai were never just stone sculptures. They were ancestors made present the visible continuation of lineage memory and spiritual authority. When a moai was fully raised on an ahu, the ritual was not finished. The decisive moment came when the eyes were set in place. The whites were made from coral, the pupils from obsidian or red basalt, creating a sharp, deep gaze. For the Rapa Nui, that was the moment the moai opened its eyes, not biologically, but as an activation. From that instant, the ancestor was no longer an abstract memory. The ancestor became an active presence capable of transmitting mana, spiritual power, protection, and legitimacy to the descendants standing before it. A crucial detail is the direction of that gaze. Most moai do not look out to sea. They turn their backs to the vast ocean, the route the Polynesian ancestors once crossed to reach the island, and they face inland toward villages, fields, and the places where people lived and cultivated. This suggests that the role of the moai was not to guide navigation or guard borders, but to oversee life. The ancestors' gaze was directed into the community as a constant presence, reminding everyone that social order, land rights, and prosperity depended on a proper relationship between the living and the dead. In that sense, moai were never meant to be silent witnesses. They were embedded in daily reality. Their stone bodies anchored social contracts that otherwise had no written form. Land boundaries, fishing rights, lineage authority, and collective memory were stabilized not by documents, but by the steady gaze of the ancestors. To live within sight of a moai was to live within a moral and cosmological framework, one in which actions were understood to be observed, remembered, and weighed beyond a single human lifetime. Order was not enforced through coercion alone, but through continuity, the sense that today's behavior mattered because it unfolded under the presence of those who had come before. This made the ahu something more complex than a shrine. It functioned as a node where the spiritual, political, and ecological dimensions of life converged. Rituals performed there were not abstract gestures toward the divine. They were acts of renewal moments when social relationships were recalibrated and reaffirmed. The ancestors embodied in stone did not demand worship in isolation. They required a world that still made their presence meaningful, a landscape capable of sustaining both human life and the symbolic economy that bound people together. That requirement placed an enormous, often invisible burden on the environment. For the Moai system to endure, Rapa Nui needed not abundance in a general sense, but reliability. Forests had to regenerate fast enough to replace felled trees. Seabird populations had to return each season in sufficient numbers. Soils had to remain fertile enough to support agriculture without constant expansion into new land. Timber had to be available not just once, but repeatedly over generations for canoes, tools housing, and the immense logistical effort of transporting statues weighing many tons across uneven terrain. When the first Polynesian settlers arrived, those conditions appeared to exist. Paleo-environmental evidence suggests that the island was once covered in dense woodland, including towering palms, unlike anything found there today. These trees were not merely background scenery. They were structural elements of society. Their trunks could serve as rollers or sleds. Their fibers could be woven into ropes. Their presence stabilized soils and slowed erosion, protecting gardens and freshwater sources. In ecological terms, the forest acted as a buffer, a system that absorbed stress and allowed human activity to continue without immediately destabilizing the whole. Just as importantly, the ecosystem provided psychological assurance. A society willing to invest years of labor into a single moai must believe implicitly that the world will remain legible long enough for that investment to matter. The carving of a statue is not an act of desperation. It is an act of confidence. It assumes that future generations will still recognize the ancestor being honored, still inhabit the land being claimed, still participate in the same symbolic language. In this way, every moai was a wager on continuity. But ecosystems, unlike stone, do not negotiate. As forest cover declined, whether through overharvesting introduced species, climate variability, or the cumulative effect of all three, the margins of error narrowed. Trees that once could be replaced within a generation took longer to regrow or failed to return at all. Without roots to anchor the soil, erosion accelerated. Gardens became harder to maintain. Canoe construction became more difficult, limiting access to offshore fishing and seabirds, which had once provided critical protein. Each ecological constraint fed back into the social system, tightening it, reducing flexibility. What made this especially destabilizing was that the symbolic order remained demanding even as material capacity shrank. Moai still required labor. Ahu still required maintenance. Lineages still needed to assert legitimacy. Ancestors still needed to be honored. But the physical means to sustain these obligations were no longer guaranteed. The system did not collapse at once. It strained. Projects slowed. Some statues remained unfinished. Others were abandoned along transport routes, frozen mid-journey, not as signs of failure, but as records of a society reaching the limits of what it could realistically sustain. At that point, the moai had not lost their meaning. They had lost their ecological footing. And once that footing disappeared, the statues began to drift out of alignment with lived reality. They still spoke the language of continuity, permanence, and inherited authority, but the world around them no longer supported those assumptions. The result was not immediate disbelief, but growing tension between what the symbols promised and what daily life could deliver. This is what made the moai eventually feel out of place. Not because people suddenly rejected their ancestors, but because the conditions that allowed ancestors to function as central organizing forces had changed. A symbol that once stabilized society began to demand more than society could afford. And when that happens, even the most sacred structures can no longer remain at the center, not through destruction alone, but through gradual disengagement. In this light, the story of Rapa Nui is not one of reckless monument building in a fragile environment. It is the story of a society whose architecture was perfectly calibrated for a world that existed until it didn't. The Moai were not mistakes. They were accurate responses to a particular ecological and social moment. When that moment passed, the statues did not suddenly become wrong. They became quietly and irrevocably misaligned with the world that had once made them possible. In near total isolation with the nearest inhabited land, thousands of kilometers away, every resource was finite. There was nowhere to import timber when the forest was gone. There was no new land to migrate to when soils eroded. Yet the great works of Rapa Nui, especially the Moai, were produced by a society that trusted in continuity. They believed the forest would last long enough. They believed resources would regenerate. They believed the existing social order lineages, competing yet held in balance, would endure long enough for the massive investments in stone to remain meaningful. That belief is what made the Moai rational in their original context. A society confident in its future can accept spending years, even decades, carving and transporting a single monumental statue. Because Moai were not made for a short-term present. They were made for continuity for many generations of descendants who would live under the gaze of the ancestors. Each Moai was a declaration this lineage will remain here. This land will continue to be cultivated. This order will endure. But that tight link between Moai and the ecosystem also created a profound kind of vulnerability. As the forest declined, transporting statues became harder. As soil eroded, agricultural yields fell, and the capacity to sustain collective labor weakened. As seabirds disappeared, protein sources shrank, and survival pressure intensified. None of this destroyed the Moai immediately. Instead, it cracked the relationship between symbol and lived reality. In that moment, Moai began to become works built for a world that was disappearing. Not because people suddenly stopped believing in their ancestors, but because the material conditions required to maintain that relationship could no longer be taken for granted. A statue left unfinished, an ahu no longer repaired, was not necessarily a sign of abrupt abandonment. It was a sign of breath running out when society no longer had the resources to complete what once felt inevitable. So, the story of the Moai is not a story of foolishness or self-destruction, as simplified accounts once suggested. It is the story of a society that built architecture and symbolism on an assumption that was reasonable in its initial setting, that the natural world around them would remain stable enough to support that social order. When that assumption became untrue, the Moai did not instantly lose meaning, but they began to lose their living ground. The ecological and social space needed to keep playing their central role. Seen this way, the Moai were not a mistake. They were the honest product of a worldview that believed in continuity. And precisely because of that, when that world changed, the Moai became silent witnesses to a time when the people of Rapa Nui once believed the relationship among ancestors, land, and community would last long enough for stone to speak in place of memory. When that belief was no longer upheld by the environment, the stone remained, but the story it once told began to close. Not with a crash, but with the quiet of an order that had passed. Creating a Moai was a long and costly process. Statues were carved directly from volcanic stone at Rano Raraku, then transported several kilometers to the coastal Ahu. Although scholars still debate the precise method of movement, dragging, rolling, or walking with ropes, no one disputes that the process demanded large-scale collective labor, tight social organization, and abundant resources. Moai were not the product of a desperate community on the edge. They were the expression of a society functioning well enough to devote strength to symbolism. But here, fragility appears not in the stone, but in the assumption of continuity. As forests were overexploited, canoe-building capacity declined, seabirds vanished, and soils eroded, the ecological foundation of society began to wobble. There was no longer enough timber to move the largest statues. There were no longer enough resources to maintain the ahu. Meanwhile, the symbolic system still demanded continuation. Ancestors still had to be honored. Mana still had to be sustained. The tension between symbolic obligation and material capacity grew sharper over time. The outcome was not an instant collapse of monuments, but incompletion. At Rano Raraku, hundreds of moai still lie in the stone, unfinished, never raised. Some were abandoned along transport routes. On the Ahu, many statues were toppled during periods of internal conflict. This does not reflect stupidity or self-destruction as earlier simplistic narratives claimed. It reflects a more complex reality, works designed for a social order that could no longer sustain itself. Unlike Angkor, where the system continued to exist, but ran out of phase, Rapa Nui faced a more fundamental problem. The conditions for the system to continue no longer existed. Moai could not be scaled down or adjusted to fit a new context. They were either fully raised and maintained, or they were not. When society could no longer complete and sustain them, moai themselves became traces of a past that could not be recovered. One crucial point often overlooked in simplified tellings is that the Rapa Nui people did not disappear with the moai. There was no single moment of extinction, no end of humanity mirroring the fall of statues. What disappeared was a particular social order while the people changed. And that change allows us to understand the moai more fairly, not as symbols of failure, but as a historical phase that completed its role. As the older order tied to moai weakened under ecological pressure, resource scarcity, and internal tension, Rapa Nui society could not continue sustaining a ritual system that required massive investment, long-term collective labor, and stable resources. Moai, with their monumental scale and high organizational demands, no longer fit the new conditions. But this did not create a ritual vacuum. Instead, new forms of organization and symbolism emerged, reflecting a society adapting to a more constrained world. The most prominent expression of that transition is the Birdman cult Tengata Manu, a new ritual and political system centered at the ceremonial village of Orongo, on the rim of the Rano Kau crater. Unlike the moai symbols of lineage continuity and long-duration ancestral authority, the Birdman cult revolved around periodic competition, shorter cycles, and individual capability. Each year, chiefs sent representatives into a dangerous contest, swimming across shark-filled waters to retrieve the first sooty tern egg from the islet of Motu Nui. Whoever returned with the egg intact elevated his lineage to the central position of power for that year. The contrast between the two orders is stark. Moai were tied to fixed land, to coastal ahu, to inherited authority sustained across generations. The Birdman cult, by contrast, was tied to time, to a decisive moment each year, where power was redistributed based on ritual outcome. In a resource-scarce society, that model was more flexible, less costly, and better suited to the new reality. No need to transport enormous stone. No need to maintain elaborate ahu. No need for long-term investment in symbols that demanded the ecological stability the island could no longer guarantee. In that new order, moai were no longer central. But this does not mean moai were rejected or defeated. They lost the social context needed to keep meaning what they once meant. A monument, no matter how massive, cannot sustain its function on its own. if the social, economic, and ecological networks that once supported it have shifted. Moai did not materially collapse because they were wrong. They became silent because the world that produced them no longer existed. That silence sometimes appeared through dramatic actions. Many Moai were toppled during phases of internal conflict. Yet even those actions do not necessarily signal a denial of ancestral belief. They can be read as the ending of an older political symbol to make space for a new order. When authority was no longer legitimized by ancestral gazes upon the Ahu, allowing statues to fall could become a material way to mark transition and ending ritual, even if it was never written down. What matters is that in the Birdman cult, the sacred did not vanish. It was reconfigured. Instead of concentrating on stone and permanence, it concentrated on the human body, on risk, on the capacity to survive a trial under harsh conditions. The sacred became mobile, short-cycled, and linked to the seabird's seasonal rhythm, a remaining resource that could still be anticipated in a world of scarcity. This is the sign of a society learning to reshape its symbolic system to match new limits. Seen from this angle, Rapa Nui is not a tragedy of total collapse, but a story of cultural restructuring. Moai did not lose to the Birdman cult. They belonged to a different world, a world of forests, large wooden canoes, and confidence in long-term continuity. When that world closed, the Moai completed their role. They became the material memory of one phase, while society continued through new forms. So when we say that a monument loses the social context to keep meaning, what it meant, we are not talking about meaninglessness. We are talking about completion. A symbol does not have to last forever to have value. It only has to exist at the right time, serve the right order, and be able to withdraw when that order is no longer present. The Moai of Rapa Nui teach that through their very silence, that architecture, like ritual and power, is not a promise of eternity, but a temporary answer humans create within a world that keeps changing. From that perspective, Rapa Nui is a profound example for the theme of this series. Moai were not built to last indefinitely in a changing world. They were built for a specific social-ecological configuration in which resources, belief, and organization were temporarily balanced. When that configuration changed, the stone remained, but the monuments no longer had living ground. Compared with earlier chapters, Rapa Nui represents a different kind of impermanence. Göbekli Tepe was intentionally closed. Woodhenge was born for a moment. Ziggurats accepted aging. The Minoans became skilled at rebuilding. Poverty Point was built for departure. Angkor died by losing rhythm. Rapa Nui shows something else. A monument can remain materially present while dying in meaning when the world that produced it is gone. Standing before the Moai today, it is easy to be pulled into a feeling of mystery and permanence. But perhaps what they truly tell us is not about endurance, but about architecture's deep dependence on living context. No monument exists in isolation. Each is the product of a relationship between people and environment, between belief and resources, between the present and expectations of the future. Rapa Nui reminds us that a monument does not need to collapse to end. Sometimes it simply needs to no longer have a world to belong to. And in the silence of stone figures facing inland, we can read a deeper message. Architecture is not built only from stone or earth. It is built from assumptions about the future. When those assumptions shift, even the most monumental works can become relics of an era that has closed not in catastrophe, but in the quiet of an order that has passed. In modern thinking, we live with a quiet but persistent anxiety, the anxiety of loss. loss of memory, loss of traces, loss of monuments, loss of order. We write things down so we won't forget, we preserve so we can resist wear, we build so we can outlast time. And when we look back at the past, we often ask questions shaped by that same anxiety. Why did they let it disappear? Why didn't they keep it? Why didn't they build it stronger, bigger, longer lasting? But those very questions reveal a vast distance between us and the ancient world. Because for most pre-modern societies, loss was not something to avoid at all costs. It was an obvious part of order. Sometimes it was even the sign that a cycle had been completed properly. We are used to seeing time as an arrow. The past passes through the present toward the future. In that model, everything is expected to move forward. Progress is measured by the ability to extend. Success is tied to lasting longer. Value is often bound tightly to the ability not to disappear. But in the ancient world, time was rarely felt as a straight line to be conquered. It was a wheel to walk alongside. Seasons arrive and leave rains fall, and stop rituals begin and end. No season lasts forever. No ritual runs continuously. No state is considered permanently correct. In that way of sensing time, ending at the right moment matters more than how long something lasts. This difference leads to a radically different understanding of memory, and this may be the point where modern thinking and ancient thinking split into almost opposite paths. We tend to place memory into objects as if memory were something fragile that needs to be held for us. A building stands there to remember in our place. A monument is erected so a community will not forget. A text is written so memory will not depend on living recollection, which can fade or distort. In this understanding, the more important a memory is, the more it must be fixed, framed, and separated from people, so it can exist independently of them. But in oral societies, memory is not understood as an object to be conserved, but as a flow that must be maintained. It does not reside in stone, wood, or earth, because those things, no matter how durable, are only mute surfaces without human interaction. Memory lives in actions repeated at the right time, in roles passed to the right people, in moments remembered by the body itself, by walking to the right place, by performing familiar gestures, by beginning and ending in the right rhythm. People remember not because they see a fixed object, but because they know when they must come, what they must do when they arrive, and when they should leave. Memory, therefore, is not separate from life. It lives inside life. In this way of operating, memory is not a storage vault, but a process. It exists only when it is activated, and each time it is activated, it becomes slightly different, not incorrect, but adapted. A ritual is never performed in exactly the same way as before because people have changed circumstances, have changed the moment, has changed. Yet it is precisely those small differences that keep memory from turning to stone. It continues to live to respond to the present instead of standing still like an exhibit of the past. This also means when no one performs the action that activates a memory, that memory does not die in the modern sense. It is not erased, not destroyed. It falls asleep. Like a ritual no longer practiced when social order changes memory, quiets down, withdraws from everyday life, but does not vanish completely. It can be awakened again if the context returns, if people once more find they need it. In this worldview, forgetting is not a moral failure, but a temporary state like silence between two drum beats. That is why ancient people did not need to anchor memory in eternal objects. They did not fear that if a monument collapsed, memory would collapse with it, because memory had never fully resided in the monument in the first place. The monument was only a meeting point, not a storage site. It helped memory be activated at the right time, but it did not hold memory hostage once its role was complete. When the meeting point was no longer necessary, memory could move into another form, or quietly withdraw with the order that had produced it. From this angle, our modern panic at the disappearance of physical traces says more about our own insecurity than about any mistake of the past. We fear losing objects because we have placed too much memory inside objects. But in oral societies, memory is placed in people, in action, in rhythm. And when people change, memory changes with them, not as decay, but as a form of adaptation. Perhaps the hardest thing for modern thinking to accept is not that ancient societies allowed monuments to disappear, but that they did not treat that as tragedy. Because for them, memory did not need to stand still in order to exist. It only needed to be lived and allowed to fall silent when the time came for it to stop speaking. That is why what ancient societies tried to preserve was not material form, but the order that the form once served. That order might be the steady rhythm of seasons, clear social roles, or a proper relationship among people, ancestors, and environment. When the order remained valid, the form held meaning. When the order changed, the form could become an obstruction. Keeping the form while the order was no longer suitable could freeze memory, making it no longer alive, no longer moving. So, letting a symbol fade is not necessarily forgetting. Sometimes it is an act of respect for a role completed, and a refusal to force that symbol to keep speaking in a world that has already changed. In modern storytelling, we often call every dissolution of the past a collapse. The word carries the feeling of chaos, failure, error. But for many ancient societies, what happened was not collapse, but the ending of a cycle. A ritual ends not because it failed, but because it finished what it came to do. An order weakens not because it was wrong, but because the conditions that once nourished it are no longer there. In that view, not every ending needs to be rescued. Some endings must be allowed to happen so they do not injure what is forming next. Perhaps that is why ancient people did not fear loss the way we do. They did not fear it because they did not place meaning in keeping everything. Meaning lay in rituals happening at the right time, communities gathering and dispersing in the right rhythm, order being felt in the present, rather than preserved for a distant, unknown future. When a symbol no longer helped people live well in the present, it did not need to keep existing in order to prove its value. Its value had already been proven in the very span of time when it was present. What confuses us when we look back is not only the disappearance of ancient monuments or orders, but the calmness of the people who let them go. We are trained to think if you do not keep, you will forget. If you do not record, you will lose. If you do not preserve, it will become meaningless. But the ancient world reveals another possibility, that people can live fully in the present without dragging the past along in material form. Memory can exist in people in rhythms of life, in patterns of action without needing to stand still in stone. If we turn the question back toward the present, it becomes an uncomfortable one if we keep everything extend, every system, preserve every symbol, resist every ending. Are we protecting order, or are we afraid to let go? Not everything that disappears is a loss, and not everything that lasts a long time is still alive. Looking back over the entire journey of this story, you can see a quiet but consistent thread. The monuments, rituals, and systems of the past were not made to last forever. They were made to answer a particular moment. When that moment passed, letting them quietly withdraw was not an error. It was a way of ending with order. Perhaps the deepest thing the ancient world leaves us is not in what still stands, but in what was allowed to disappear without needing justification. Because sometimes the ability to let go at the right time is also a form of knowledge about time. As this story slowly comes to a close, perhaps what lingers is not the names of the 7 structures, but something much stranger, a feeling that we modern humans have grown accustomed to living in fear of disappearance. We fear data being erased, fear memories fading, fear buildings collapsing, fear that we ourselves might leave no trace behind. But the ancient civilizations in this story do not seem to have carried that fear. They built as if time were a current, not an enemy. For them, a structure could fulfill its purpose within a few rainy seasons. A city could matter for only a single generation. A ritual could be right for only one precise cosmic moment. And when that moment passed, there was no need to hold on. We often ask what caused these civilizations to collapse. But perhaps sometimes the right question is this: did they truly see it as a collapse? Or was it simply the end of a phase that had already been accepted? The 7 structures you've just heard about did not fail because of ignorance. Quite the opposite. They existed because of a profound understanding of human limits, of the fragility of systems, of the rhythms of nature, and of this truth, that not everything needs to last forever to be meaningful. Perhaps the greatest mystery of these structures does not lie in stone earth or form, but in a quiet question they leave behind for us. If something is certain to disappear, is it worth any less? If you're listening now with heavy eyes as your thoughts begin to slow, then let that question stay with you for a while. There's no need to answer it. And as usual, before we truly close, if you'd like, leave me a comment and tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it for you right now? Wishing you a peaceful sleep. And I'll see you again in other stories where history does not rush and time is allowed to move slowly.